Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. I am Pat Soldano, President of Family Enterprise USA. We advocate for generationally owned family businesses and their lifetime of savings at a national level in Washington, D.C. We represent all sizes of business, small, medium, and large, and all industries. I'm very pleased today to have our webinar, which is entitled Family Vision and Values, the Starting Point of Estate Planning. The speakers will be Jim Coutré, who is Managing Director and Shareholder, as well as Head of Wealth Planning Group at Pathstone, and Scott Weaver, who is the Chief Fiduciary Officer. So in this webinar today, Family Vision and Values, the Starting Point of Estate Planning, a senior Pathstone executive, Jim and Scott, will share their insights into why estate planning should begin with a clear articulation of the family's vision and values, how this preparation supports the selection of appropriate strategies, and how these concepts in action. They will share examples from their years of working with clients from the family dynamics and fiduciary perspective, respectively. And we will take questions at the end. But please, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll end the Q&A. We will attempt to monitor those questions. But both Jim and Scott have a lot to talk to you about today. So please bear with us. We'll do our best and allow for questions at the end. And I know that those of you who have registered also submitted questions. We have those questions, and they are going to attempt to answer those questions in their remarks today. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott so you can start.
Pat, thank you so much. Great to be here. And thanks also to Family Enterprise USA and the work that you do for families and family enterprises. Scott Weaver, I'm the Chief Fiduciary Officer with Pathstone. Jim and I thought this would be a great opportunity to share a conversation that we've had recently with a number of Pathstone families. And really the context is that we're coming up on the sunsetting of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the end of 2025. And so as part of that sunsetting of the tax rules, some of the estate tax exemptions are going to decrease markedly from about $13.6 million to about $7 million per individual taxpayer. And families in general and families in business in particular may be saying, how does this impact me? Should I be doing some planning? What are the tax consequences? And what Jim and I want to make sure that we communicate throughout this is that managing the family business and managing the family business in a tax efficient way are essential to multi-generational enterprise. But you can't let that get in the way of making sure that it stays a family business, emphasis on family. So what Jim and I hope to communicate to you is ways that you can talk to your family about wealth, ways that you can talk to your family about values, and then you can use those conversations to inform your determinations about wealth transfer planning. Should you plan? Is your plan sufficient? And then how do you make sure that you're set up for success going forward? And we think now is an opportunity because there will be changes to the tax code. Planning is a choice, and whether or not you choose to plan ought to be a choice that you make mindfully, taking into account not only the tax and business and financial implications of a plan, but also the impact that that plan will have on your family, because this may be a plan that your family has to live with over the course of the next several generations. So pleased to be here today. Jim, do you want to kick us off?
No, I think that's thank you for that tee up there, Scott. Right. So, what we believe at Pathstone is that wealth planning is very much a technical exercise. It's also very much a human exercise, right? The technical and the human within wealth planning are not kind of either sides of the coin. They're integrated, right? And we want to make sure that any sort of planning is done with both the technical and the human in mind. And Scott, one of the things that we've seen, you and I have talked about because of the sunsetting of those exemptions, is that there's lots of families that are almost like panic, like racing, like should we start planning now? Should we start planning now? And that puts fear in me that these families are going to let the tax tail wag the dog, right? And we know that when you do planning just based alone on tax with a sole tax focus, like there's ways that you could be hurting your family, right? You can act in a way that ultimately conflicts with your goals and your values and your priorities I mean, think about passing down a gift to a child that's not ready, doesn't have the technical emotional skills to receive it. Tax alone can allow you to give in ways that contradict the values that you've been trying to instill, right? So if you're super focused on entrepreneurship and you also you set up a trust that can't be accessed to fund an entrepreneurial venture or kind of supplement a regular paycheck, right? But can be used in an effective rehab in Tahiti, like, right, that you're not reinforcing those same values, the right values of your family. You can give in a way that undermines your grandchildren's parents, right? If you care about family, you don't want to be doing that. You can be giving in a way that demonstrates a profound lack of confidence and trust in one of your loved ones, right? So think about, locking up money until they're in their 70s or 80s and they don't have the opportunity to really use it to make their lives better, and you don't have the opportunity to see the joy of them using it. And also giving in ways that really either divides or binds together families, that family members that maybe shouldn't be bound together. Right. So when you kind of take taxes as the only driver, or, even kind of, you can apply that also to that framework of just thinking about the business and not thinking about the family, right? It's your estate planning is going to be more likely to land on the beneficiaries, land on those inheritors as a transfer of assets, right? Instead of a gift or even a gift of love, which we hope your estate plan will be, because there's the opportunity to really enhance the lives of the people that you care about and to make the world a better place. So we want to make sure you're doing that.
And Jim, I would add, there is nothing more destructive to family businesses or to families than fights about family businesses and about family wealth. And so making sure that your plan reflects your values and creates the incentives that you intend and doesn't create incentives you don't intend is so important to make sure that family businesses continue to be both families and businesses.
Right. And so, I mean, that's the starting place there for when you're thinking about estate planning. It's like, where do you start? Don't dive into technical strategies. Don't start with the what of the plan. I love people to start with the why of the plan, right? Why are you planning? It's, again, like you said, Scott, it's a choice, right? So hopefully you're planning because it's not just just because you're hoping to save some taxes. Hope you're planning because you want to enhance the life of those people around you, right? So I think there's lots of ways you can approach this, but like, I'll just share kind of 3 simple questions that you should explore that I think will really set up those conversations and set up your strategy for your estate plan well. The first is, what is your overarching vision of success for your family and the values that drive you? Second question is, what is the purpose of your financial wealth? And then subsequently, how can you use estate planning to make progress towards those goals? Right? So like, what does that look like in action? I think the most important part is like, what does success look like? And families, tackle this a whole number of different ways. It can just be really informal conversations. It can be in the car, it can be around the dinner table, but it can also be more formal. A lot of families, especially ones that are kind of practice working together because of an operating business, tend to find a lot of value in doing something more formal, like using a values inventory or like a values card set, with the multi-generational family. Lots of the families that we work with find value in using a family capitals framework to kind of map out what are the important elements in life to them around, let's say, their legacy capital, their relationship capital, their human capital, their social capital. Lots of families go and develop, family vision statements. And again, that could just be sitting back and saying, hey, when we're 90 and looking back on a life well lived, like, how will we have defined that? Like, what are the things that we will reflect on and say, yeah, we did that right, and our family's in the place that we want, right? So is formal or informal, you get those things out there, and then you can start to apply that lens of what is the purpose of your money, right? Because we know money is not an end, it's a means, right? No one has ever laid on their deathbed, abandoned by everybody who once loved them, and said, thank goodness I got such great investment returns, right? Like, that doesn't happen. So really reflecting on how can your money be used to support those goals, which then it leads you right into that third question of what role can your estate play, right? That's that kind of natural progression from those previous 2 questions. And maybe your estate plan, just puts just enough money in your kids' hands to allow them to make, small mistakes before they get, much larger sums. Maybe your plan, the gifts kind of demonstrate how much value you've gotten and received from a sibling or a friend or a loved one. Maybe your plan is really about setting up a charitable giving vehicle that gives your family now the chance to kind of bring about the change that they want to see in the world, or an opportunity for your family to stay working together after the operating business is no longer in the family, right? So you kind of bring all these things together, the vision, the values, the purpose of wealth, and they can lead to very different plans. So I'll just two examples, right? So let's say, for example, your core values center around self-reliance, career achievement, and giving back. And let's say that's because of the satisfaction that you felt in building and selling your business, and now the gratitude that you feel now that you're able to kind of shift your focus to be involved more in the community. And in that, you can reflect on and you see the purpose of your financial wealth is really to enjoy what you've earned, right? And to provide meaning to that next chapter in your life by alleviating the suffering of others. So in this case, a plan may look like passing just enough money, but to provide a safety net for your kids, but really moving the majority of your estate kind of down towards your philanthropic efforts, right? Because those have become such an important part of your life after your business exit. Alternatively, another family, if let's say they have core values around creativity, fulfillment, togetherness as a family, and let's say that's because they had a life that experience was kind of defined by a career that they disliked. Maybe it's a career that they felt forced to pursue for financial reasons, but then they found happiness in being part of a big, close-knit, loving family. Right. And so in this case, if maybe the family sees the purpose of their wealth as the purpose of their financial wealth as, to give their kids that financial boost that they need to work hard in whatever career field they're drawn to, regardless of how well it pays. And then this family might see that their, kind of financial wealth is a tool for creating experiences for the family to come together and to play and grow as a family. Right. So in that case, that estate plan may look very different than the other example. This estate plan may really provide money to allow the kids today to supplement incomes, right? And maybe stash them away for retirement in trusts. And they might also create, for example, a trust intended to fund family travel or retreats or just an opportunity to play together, right? So no right or wrong answer there, but it's really about being intentional in who you are, who you want your family to be, and then how you can use that planning to support that.
And Jim, I would add there that for a lot of families who have multi-generational operating businesses, maybe it's has been said out loud, maybe it's just implied, is that maintaining family ownership and operation of that family business is crucial to the family legacy. And so making sure that, providing, as you said, opportunities for family involvement and family ownership versus family management, I think is a really important conversation to have that ought to be had out loud, not just with the current family managers, but with the next generation. And that also leads to a point we'll emphasize later, which is making sure that folks are prepared to assume those roles. So I think starting those conversations early and framing them from a place of values is really important, because there are a lot of family enterprises where I think there's families just assume that, of course, we want to continue being a family in business, as opposed to having an exit event or taking on an equity partner to generate liquidity that allows for the type of planning you've just outlined. So I think for families that own operating enterprises, planning for the family and planning for the family business are part and parcel.
Right, and you just underlined one of the key threads that runs through all of this which is communication, Scott. Right, it's always constantly having the communication with the family about kind of who you are, who you want to be, how you're living. Are you moving towards those goals? Right? And I think that many of the business owning families that I work with have a leg up on this, because often because of the business they have more practice working and communicating together. Right. And so given that, I think it's even more critical to be talking and communicating with family around any sort of estate planning. Right. So when I think about best practices for effective estate plans, effective meaning that enhance the life of the family and really go about the intended, the intent of using your estate plan to move your family towards your vision of success, that has to involve talking with the impacted people around it, talking with your family about it, right? And I know talking about estate plans is not comfortable. right? And there's risk in doing it. You might offend people, you know, you might kind of show your hand. You might get lots of different opinions about what it should be versus what you want it to be, right? Those are concerns. But I think the alternative of talking with your family, I'll call the impacted people, right? Is working and building plans off of assumptions, right? And that's just a bad idea with it with estate planning, right? Because when you're doing assumptions, that might not align. What you think people need and want and what's good for them might not align with what they need and want and what they think is good for them. Right?
Jim, I'll add 2 points there. Point number 1 is please don't romanticize surprise. The reading of the will that you see on movies or TV shows, that doesn't happen. And so to the extent you're comfortable and appropriate with beneficiaries' age and stage in life, please communicate to them your intentions. You don't have to necessarily throw open the books and show them every nickel that they're intending to receive, but at the same time, beneficiaries need to be prepared to accept roles that maybe haven't been communicated to them, whether it's as a trustee or as a member of a family business board or a family philanthropic board. So people need time to prepare and structure their lives to accept these roles in the family. And the other point is obviously, if the goal is for a family member to take over an active role in an operating company, and that's outside of their core area of expertise, they need time to prepare, to get up to speed, to be brought into the fold and understand the way the current management thinks about everything from operating the company, strategic goals, and then risk management, all the way down. So being exposed to aspects of the family enterprise are important to help them understand the way things have been done and to understand what is expected of them going forward.
Scott, I remember an exchange I had with a client early in my career, where she broke down into tears, and what had happened was she was transferred the ownership of the business from her dad when he passed. She had never talked about it. She didn't want it. Her brothers wanted it, and that totally blew apart the family, right? And it blew apart her relationship with her dad that she can't rebuild because he's no longer with us, right? And so that idea that this incredible heartache and basically explosion of a family could happen because they didn't take the time to talk about it before it happened, right? That's just like upsetting. We want to make sure that other families aren't doing that, right? And I think talking about the estate plan is really important, but what's even better is if you can co-create it with the impacted people, right? So that's not just that here's what we're doing, but it's like, hey, here's what I'm thinking. Will you help me shape it? Right. And it's definitely, that's again, it comes with some risks. It requires some communication skills and some relationship capital with your family, with the impacted people. And you have to be realistic if you have those or not, or if you need to kind of brush up and build on them. And it also requires a lot of expectation setting in those conversations. So you need to go into that co-creation conversation, really being clear with what you're asking of the impacted people. Right? Are you just allowing them to kind of share their thoughts? Do they have any sort of influence over your decision making? Do they have any actual decision making powers in this? Right? There's plenty of sensitivities around it, but when it's done right, we've absolutely seen it kind of strengthen relationships now, protecting relationships down the road, and then also really increasing the likelihood that the estate plan is going to have the intended positive impact. Right?
Yeah, and it also gives you some feedback, right? Because if after someone passes and then someone finds out that they're to be a trustee or, have some role in a family business, there's really no training there. Whereas if it's communicated in advance, it gives you the opportunity to see, okay, how might this go? How is this person reacting? And so I think it can perversely actually solve some of the fears that so many people have about talking to their kids about wealth in the next generation. Because as Jim said, we're all operating on our own assumptions, and you might be pleasantly surprised, or you might be disappointed, but that's important information to make sure your plan is actually effective.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's generally got 4 kind of tips that I give to folks before they talk to an impacted person about their plan. Mm-hmm. That first is just be really clear on what you're doing and the why, right? So again, we want you to start with the why. Why is this plan in place? You need to be able to articulate that. And if you have a spouse or partner, you need to make sure that you're aligned on that as a couple, right? The second prep is just practice explaining the why in front of somebody else, right? Because what might seem really rational in your head may come out as like misleading or maybe even hurtful, if you use the wrong words. So there's just a lot of value in just, throwing it in front of your estate planning attorney or a trusted advisor or a friend or a spouse. The third is, I encourage all of our clients to do this, is when you're explaining any sort of gift, a transfer of wealth that you want to land as a gift, call it such. Say, this is a gift. And when you can, say, this is a gift of love, right? And explain how this is a gift of love. And if you can't explain why this transfer is your wealth planning, your estate planning is a gift of love, stop and go back and think about why you're doing it. It's a plan. You can have the opportunity to have an amazing positive impact and enhance lives in your family. Make sure you're taking advantage of that. And then finally, just that last thing before you have conversations around your estate plan is just kind of prepare yourself to keep your kind of response or reactions in check. Because you may, like you said, Scott, you may very well hear something that you weren't expecting, right? And sometimes, like if you freak out and you kind of snap back or have a really negative response to something that you hear, that actually probably undermines or could work against some of the values that you're trying to live and build through your estate plan. So just make sure that you're kind of going into it to understand, if you hear something that upsets you, be prepared to, if you need to, just stop, pause, wrap up the conversation, regather, and go back in, right? And I love these conversations because, yeah, they can be dicey, but it's also going to be a really great opportunity to learn something about a loved one, and a really great opportunity to work together towards, kind of the outcomes that you both want to have.
Jim, something you said that I think is so important is that gifts, they come in many different flavors, but the idea is that ultimately it's a gift of love. It's, I love you and I trust you to be an equity owner in our family enterprise, to take over and steward and shepherd and grow and treasure and value what I've spent my life building, right? And I tell people that when someone gives you money, effectively, they're giving you hours of their life, because they didn't have to devote their time to earning that money, building that business, creating that wealth. They could have gone surfing. They could have gone skiing. They could have gone fly fishing. They could have spent more time at home with their family. And so I think it's really important to understand that just because you give someone a gift and it's characterized as a gift of love, doesn't mean that it doesn't also come with certain expectations and accountabilities. So I think you can say, this is a gift, but it's also comes with, expectations, and effort is going to be required.
Right. And that's the other thing. Love have gift givers reflect on two questions when they're thinking about or talking about their estate plan. And the first is, what does it mean to be a good gift giver? And the second is, what does it mean to be a good gift receiver? Right. So you can take some time to kind of think about those two things and map out what that means to you. You're more likely to kind of create a gift that lands with the intended impact that you want. And you're much more likely to be able to communicate to the gift receiver, what it means and what your expectations are. Right. And the more clear you can be about what your expectations are for how the gift is received or how the gift is acknowledged or not acknowledged, it's just going to create, set the family up for success. Scott, do we want to jump in deeper a little bit into kind of strategy around?
Yeah, I think so, Jim. And I think this is a perfect opportunity, because we've just set the table for, you can give a gift and it can be a gift of love, but it can also come with incentives, expectations, and accountability. And we spend a lot of time talking to clients about wealth transfer. And, in the Western world, a lot of times those gifts are given in a trust. And I personally am a disciple of the trust, because I think it's a great way to protect wealth for multiple generations, particularly when it's a family business where estate taxes can be so devastating to a family enterprise. So you can protect wealth and wealth appreciation, not only from taxes, but also from, unfortunate family events like marital dissolutions. But I also think it's a really important way to begin to incentivize the type of behaviors that you want to see and to disincentivize the type of behaviors that you don't want to see. And so if you don't want your family to live hand to mouth, you want them to be empowered wealth owners, then maybe it doesn't make sense to say, well, they can get no more than $2,000 a month from the trust. Because instead of creating a trust where there's opportunities for entrepreneurship and impact, for example, paying for a down payment on a house or investing in an entrepreneurial enterprise or providing income support while someone is getting their business up and running, it really creates this sort of dependency and disempowering outcome. So I'm a big believer in making sure that if you're creating trusts, you're communicating the reason you're using trust to your beneficiaries, right? Because if I'm expecting a big inheritance or I'm expecting to be an owner of the family business, and instead that's owned in a family trust where I don't have direct ownership and control, then that ought to be communicated in advance. In a moment, I'm going to talk about ways that we structure to try to get the best of all worlds. But I think it's really important to talk about the reasons that you structured things the way you have. And oftentimes, though, there are technical legal reasons or tax savings reasons why assets go into a trust, why certain types of structures are used. And your estate planning attorneys will be able to advise you about the specific structures that make sense for your family. I don't think we have enough time today to dive into that. But I do think that when it comes to, how do you structure a gift, the use of trust is very important. And that's particularly true for family enterprises. And the reason for that is because the magic of the trust is that it divides ownership, that is beneficial ownership, the use and enjoyment, the economic interest from the control, from the management. And so trusts allow families to create governance structures around the ownership of their family wealth that don't necessarily mean you have to have outright ownership and that person is guaranteed a seat at the shareholder meeting or a seat on the board. And it can be really powerful for families that are larger. It can be really powerful for families with younger children or children who are not yet ready to have a seat at the table, but who we still want them to ultimately grow into that role. And it can also be really powerful for consolidated management, right? One of the killers of family wealth is fractionalization. You look at a family like the Vanderbilts, who, over the course of several generations, through fractionalization, mismanagement, and family disharmony, saw an evaporation of an extraordinary amount of wealth because they hadn't properly incentivized and planned for multiple generations. And so trusts are a tool that you can use to make sure that your family enterprise stays together. And it can also provide for, a difference between, those who are operating within the family business, who have an active role in management and operations, versus those who are passive investors. Now, there's always going to be some tension there, but I think a little planning ahead and forethought can definitely mitigate some of the potential bad outcomes that come from, going from one shareholder to 3 to 9 to 27 and so on. So I think that's a really important conversation to have with your wealth planning attorney, is making sure that your plan is appropriate and provides both opportunities for family ownership, opportunities for family management, as well as on-ramps and off-ramps. Because as Jim said in his introductory remarks, when family members feel like they're held hostage by wealth transfer plans, and they can only be a part of the family if they're a part of the family business, they can only access family wealth if they're a part of the family business, that leads to disputes. And disputes lead to lawsuits, and lawsuits lead to nobody getting rich but the lawyers, if I may disparage my own for a moment. So we want to make sure that the wealth transfer plan provides for on-ramps and off-ramps, dispute resolution, and appropriately gives family members the ability to pull levers to make sure that the family wealth is working for them and not vice versa.
And I'll just jump in, and all that just underscores the importance and the value in co-creating those estate plans with the impacted people, because in those conversations, you're going to find out what those motivators are. What are those things that are top of mind to them? What are those things that they fear, right? Those are going to be outed so they can be addressed in your planning.
That's right. I also think it's an important time, Jim, for you to begin to understand, like, what is the family culture around business management and wealth management generally? Because every family has their own structures and frameworks, but I think thoughtful trust planning and really thoughtful trust governance planning, what I would refer to as fiduciary control, particularly while wealth creators are still living and are able to exert some influence over that, is a great way to set families up for success, because it's not just I'm going to run it till I drop dead and then the kids will figure it out, right? Because maybe that's not the best outcome. Maybe the answer is let's begin to develop a process and a framework where we collectively talk about the family business while that patriarch or matriarch is still living, so that then they have the ability to steer and influence and create good habits before it comes time.
Right, and the articulation of all that around the trust and around the estate plan can be that steady state that's there, especially when families go through that identity, potentially identity crushing transition from being a family that runs a business to a family that just manages money together, right? That can be really hard for some families to make that transition. And so having kind of what matters most and having those kind of values and the intent of that baked into your trust structures and baked into the estate plan kind of helps remind folks of kind of who you are, who you want to be, and then it's not necessarily always tied to the business that you once operated.
Yeah, that's right, Jim. I think this is a good time to introduce two final concepts that I have. And they are really 2 points. Number one is modern fiduciary solutions. And what I mean by that is, how do you build fiduciary control structures, i.e. trustee structures, that allow family members to participate in areas where they want to, but where you can have independent professional support and guidance based on the needs of the family? And then number two is, how do you bring in and identify advisors, attorneys, independent operators, et cetera, in a way that is consistent with the overall family values and make sure that family members still have ultimate control of their wealth? So first, I want to talk briefly about modern fiduciary solutions. A lot of folks think, I don't want a professional trustee because I don't want to turn over the reins of my family business to some third-party manager. They'll run it into the ground, or more likely they'll sell it and just invest in public securities, and our family legacy is no longer. And we work with a lot of business owning families, and we work with them to build control structures where family members are in charge of the aspects of the family business they need to be, but then they have professional support in terms of administration and implementation of the trusts. Sometimes there are tax sensitivities that need to be considered. Sometimes you have to bring in independent advisors, sometimes because family members aren't ready or don't want to, sometimes because there's tax sensitivities around certain powers. But I think it's really important that when you think about, who do I want to be my trustee, you don't immediately go to, well, it ought to be the 3 kids, they'll figure it out. Think about whether or not there's opportunities to involve a professional administrative trustee, which is part of what we do. Think about whether you want to have some independence. There's opportunities to build governance committees, either in trusts or at private trust companies. We've presented on that previously. So I would encourage you to think creatively around, who do we want to be involved? And to share a quick story, I'm speaking with a client who is thinking about, he has a family business. 3 of the 5 kids are actively involved in management, 2 of the 5 aren't. And so there are some trust structures in place. And I just asked him, I said, how do you plan to address the natural tension where 3 of the 5 are creating substantial additional wealth in their operating roles at the business? And then you have 2 of the 5 who are just passive shareholders. And how do you plan to deal with the tension that those 3 of the 5 operators probably want to keep more wealth in the business and continue to grow it and build it as a legacy asset, whereas 2 of the 5 probably just want to check? And so thinking through those dynamics is so important, because those are the types of situations that can really be difficult on families. And I don't have a magic bullet. I wish I did, because I could sell it and retire. But what you have to do is understand, what are the incentives? Where do we need to create separate pools of wealth so people aren't drinking one another's milkshakes? Where do we need to have co-ownership and collective management and decision about the family enterprise to make sure that it can continue? And also, how do we make sure that if the family decides that they want to have an exit, they're empowered to do so? The second point I'll make is that when we talk to families about fiduciaries, i.e. trustees, we encourage them to think multi-generationally. If you're creating trusts, in every state, they can last for at least 100 years. In some states, they can last for, in Wyoming, it's 1,000 years. In some states, it's truly perpetual. And so you're creating a structure that's going to live longer than anyone who is currently alive, and that will last longer than anyone you will meet during your lifetime, as long as the wealth continues to support it. So we talk about creating durable fiduciary solutions that have built-in succession plans. Who is going to be in charge? And I'm a big believer that families should ultimately be in control of their wealth to the extent possible, but that they should have professional support from a firm like a Pathstone and a Willow Street, from quality estate planning attorneys and CPAs, but ultimately all of those people need to be accountable to the wealth owners and the family business owners. So we talk about, having external expertise, particularly in a world where tax compliance, tax reporting, tax planning is getting more and more complicated. I feel comfortable saying the tax code is going to get more complex before it gets any simpler. And that's particularly true if you have any kind of cross-border elements in your business. I also think that there is some efficiency, both in terms of fees, but also more importantly, in terms of user experience. We work with a lot of families who are focused on building their family business, on running their family business. And so being a trustee and being a fiduciary is not the priority. They would love to outsource that in a way that allows them to maintain control over the core decisions, i.e., should we keep the family business or should we sell it? Who should we put on the board? How do we want to capitalize it? When do we want to take wealth out of the family enterprise? But then there are people to do the blocking and tackling and administration. Final point is, we are coming up on the sunsetting of the Trump tax cuts, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the end of 2025. We are seeing already wealth planning attorneys, business appraisers, accountants, and other tax professionals with pretty significant capacity constraints, and I expect it's only going to get worse. So start the conversation now. Start talking to your estate planning attorney, get on their calendar. They may not be able to see you for a month or 6 weeks, but get in line, start having these conversations, even if you decide to do nothing before the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. As Jim said, make it intentional, make it a choice rather than an outcome that's forced upon you because you didn't plan ahead. And if you don't like your wealth manager, you don't like your estate planning attorney, you don't like your CPA, you don't like your trustee, shop around, because this is a relationship that you need to be able to trust, and you need to be able to have a candid conversation with about the types of matters that we've just discussed. And that's particularly true if you have a family where there's not alignment of values and interests. One of the questions we got during the preview was, what do I do if, the subsequent generation doesn't have the same values that I do? And I think, Jim, that might be a great way to wind up, is to how do you have those conversations? How do you prepare family members? How do you deal with, difference in opinion and view?
Right. That's a great way to do it. And I think that also, Scott, that kind of ties nicely to kind of bring the conversation, to wrap up the conversation, which is, I think we spent a lot of time talking about kind of the why of estate planning, right? We've taken some time talking about the what of estate planning. And now it's that kind of, all right, so you've got your plan. Like, how do you make sure that this is going to implement, right? How do you make sure, how do you help it land correctly? Right? And I think, when clients ask me about that, it really comes down to two things. It comes down to communications and preparation. Right? And we've talked a lot about kind of co-creating and talking with your family about it. So I will just add one thing, another way of communicating, and then we'll talk a little bit about what that preparation looks like. Right? Having the conversations, co-creating, ideal, right? Because then you can address those issues live if they're, let's say, not in alignment of values, or there's misalignment of expectations, right? Being able to work through those things as comfortable as they are is critically important. There's also going to be times where those conversations, you want to go beyond that, and you want to do some kind of historical documenting of, what you're doing and why. What is the intent behind this? And so we have clients at an additional in addition to kind of conversations, co-creation, they'll use they'll put pen to paper and create kind of an explanation of their kind of hopes and their wishes around their planning, right? So we have lots of clients that love to use like preambles, letters of wishes, and ethical wills, right? That really capture the spirit of the trust or the plan in a way that the legal documents can't, right? I love preambles. Explains the why. I love the example of, the US Constitution. The US Constitution dives into defining the legislative branch with the Congress and the House of Representatives. Why do we need a Congress and a House of Representatives? There comes the preamble, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, blah, blah, blah. It kind of lays out the why. This is the intent of that. And just doing something simple on that on top of any sort of plan can be really powerful. I mean, it could be something as simple as mom and I are establishing this trust as a gift of love to our children. We created it in recognition of the kind, responsible humans we know them to be. And we hope it to be used to enhance their lives by creating opportunities to explore, grow, and play. Anything like that. You just put that on top of all of the legal structures, all the legal documents. And that's gonna help make that planning land better.
Yeah,
right?
and
And
Jim,
also,
you can also add things like, we hope that, this trust is initially funded with an interest in the family enterprise, and we hope this trust provides a tool and a framework for our family to continue to collaborate in the ownership, management, and growth of our family business, but also to provide a tool for the family to collectively decide if they should no longer own that family business, and a way to continue forward, right? So it can be both at that aspirational, like, here's what we hope for, but also this is why we created this particular trust or set of trusts or shareholder agreement or whatever, is that it can be both very aspirational and also very pragmatic.
right. And yes, I've seen things that have kind of overstepped and feel like they're, kind of controlling from the grave. So I think as long as people approach it being sensitive to that. But what I also found, if folks approach it, again, thinking about the planning as a gift of love, they tend to write and document things that aren't that over detailed, controlling the grave. Example, I love work with a client, and he just wrote a simple 5-page letter that kind of explained why they were setting up the trust and what his intent was. And he included simple things like, we want you to use this to, to buy a car, not a Ferrari, but just like a good, safe, comfortable car. We want you to use this trust to buy a home, not a second beach house, but like a home, a place that gets you, closer to work so you can commute less and spend more time with your family, right? So just kind of mapping out the intent behind some of the things just really made that really created something that lived, right?
And that's also really useful to trustees, right? Because your trust says, my trustee may with sole and absolute discretion distribute as much of the income or principal as the trustee determines. And as a professional trustee, I look at that and say, well, what do I do with that? How do I figure that out? And so having that context and that letter of wishes, like the one Jim just referenced, it's like, okay, so that's really helpful. We can help the beneficiary buy a car, but not a Ferrari. It gives context and contour to a lot of the decisions that trustees, especially professional trustees, are asked to make. And it gives us a little insight into, what makes you tick. And especially for family, family business owning families, where an asset of the trust may very well be, equity in the family business, helping us understand what it is that you hope to accomplish and what is your vision, not only for your family, but for your family's wealth in the form of the enterprise, makes such a massive difference.
Right. And that's right there, Scott. That's such a key to that second point, which is preparing, right? How do you prepare the impacted people? How do you prepare the trustee, and how do you prepare the beneficiary? And I love that letter, going back to the client that wrote that 5-page letter, his trustee was actually a good friend of his who knew him, knew his kids, and kind of do that. But he knows that trustee the successor trustee is going to be an independent, a corporate trustee. And so he wants to make sure that those things are memorialized to go passed down. And I love, Scott, that you point out that as a independent trustee, you love to have this information, because I've talked to so many clients whose independent trustees have never asked for that context, have never asked to learn about the beneficiaries, never asked to learn about the intent of that. And I like to counsel people, if your future trustees have never asked about that, why? Like, what does that say? Is that concerning? Do you need to really think about, is this the right trustee for you and your family? Right.
And that's, Jim, it's so important, especially for families who don't just have marketable securities and, financial wealth, where, there are going to be difficult questions down the line at some point about when and how, what is the future of the business? And so having a letter of wishes that speaks not only to hopes for the beneficiary and expectations around, use and consumption versus stewardship of wealth, but also guidance for, hopes for the future of the business. Because it could be, this business has been in our families for generations. It is the legacy of my great-great-grandfather. And my sincere hope is that, it continues to be owned and controlled by the family for so long as that's practicable. On the other hand, it might be, I built this business. It's not a good time to sell right now, but, cash out when you can. Part of being a good business person is knowing when to sell. So, but those are two entirely different frameworks that a trustee would need to understand in implementing your wishes. So I think it matters both to the enterprise and to the family members and the intersection of the two.
Yeah, that's great. And I also love, Scott, just that kind of making sure you understand what your trustee believes their job to be. Right, because I definitely have run across trustees who believe that their job is to protect the trust from the beneficiaries. And again, if that's how your trustee sees their role, you should really stop and pause. Right. I think when a trustee sees their role as to use the trust to enhance the life of the beneficiaries, right? Then that's they're going to approach all those decisions that they come to with just a different mindset. Right. So if they're going to, deny distributions, or they're going to move assets, or kind of do whatever, they're doing so in the service of the human, and not just within the service of the contractual trust.
And Jim, that's where some of the modern fiduciary solutions, like the directed trust that I referenced, are so important, because I think having, family members or independent advisors involved in collaborating on those types of decisions, especially for family enterprises of scale, having one person hold the power of the purse and in some instances be compensated based on the size of the trust creates conflicts and tension. And so I think you always want to think through, where do we want family members making decisions? How can we empower them to do so? If they're not ready, how can we make sure that there's on-ramps when they are? What are we doing in the interim to get them ready and provide them with the skills and experience and training that they need so that they can step up to the plate?
Yeah, that's the prepping of the beneficiary, right? It's not just on the trustees. What is the beneficiary's role? Again, thinking back to the question, what does it mean to be a good gift receiver, right? Just make sure that they're learning, make sure they understand the trusts, make sure they're understanding what the roles of the different players are, right? That's a hugely great way to prepare them. And then I also love the concept, and then Scott will kind of wrap this up and jump to some questions. I also have the concept of really focusing on the trustee beneficiary relationship and how to get that off on the right foot, right? So make sure that, have your trustees and your beneficiaries meet, have them talk about themselves, get to know one another as people, get to understand kind of what each other's kind of lived experiences are and how that shapes their thinking and their decision making. Ideally, you can have them kind of collaborate on a learning plan, right? There's many beneficiaries don't understand how trusts work and understand what it means and what it doesn't mean, what they have control over, what they don't have control over. And if the two of them can do that together collaboratively, that's a great way to build that relationship capital before the trust is enacted. And it just will set up the trustee as kind of just a good kind of source of answers, and good partnership there. And then also I'd love to encourage people to just look around at the small things that kind of set the dynamic between the two of them. I think a lot about just do they feel that the trustee is approachable? Do they feel that the trustee is relatable? Do they feel that the trustee is judging them? I think about just even taking a look at your trustee's office and trying to imagine what a beneficiary would feel like coming in there. Is it welcoming? Are they sitting at the same side of the table? Or is it this intimidating, dark wood paneled, trustee sitting behind that big ominous desk with the big ominous leather chair, kind of looking down upon the young beneficiary, right? Just be intentional, be thoughtful about those little things and about how the two of them can kind of start off on the right foot as opposed to starting off with in an uncomfortable place or with a weird paradigm.
And Jim, to summarize, I think that's especially true if you have family member trustees, where you have a parent and a child or cousins or, aunts and uncles, nieces and nephews, where a family member may have to go to another family member and ask for a distribution. That dynamic can be extraordinarily difficult, particularly when it involves things like, hey, I need a distribution for a very private medical issue that I'd really rather not discuss with you. So we see a lot of families who are actually transitioning away from family member trustees because they've said, we want to be father and son. We want to be brother and sister. We don't want to be trustee and beneficiary, because all of a sudden one family member has power of the purse over the other and stands between that person and their inherited wealth.
I was just with some 20-somethings last week, and two things that I heard is, like, I want a Peloton, but I think if my uncle will be really judgy about that. And so I'm afraid to ask. He's like, it's good for my health, like it's exercise, but like, I don't want to be judged. And then another one was, I just want my dad to be my dad. I don't want my dad to be my banker, right? So that's a really great point. Scott, like I'm looking, we've got a couple minutes left here to kind of tackle some questions. I don't know, Pat, do you want to throw some questions at us? You want us to try to pick a couple that were sent in ahead of time?
Yeah, let's, I'm going to remind everyone, we haven't gotten any questions in the chat or the Q&A. We don't have much time left, but if you have any you want to put up there, do it quickly, please. I have two questions that I think are really important. We did have a lot of questions upon registration, but I think too, you've addressed this a little bit in terms of talking about the family tree and the values and the vision. But how do you go about doing that if you have multiple generations and the generations don't share those values? And what about the family business? You talked about both of these things, but what about the family business? And you have family members that are in the business and family members that have sold out of the business. Some have ownership, some don't. A lot of complications in terms of not only the business, but the dynamic. So I realize there's not one solution that fits all families, and you have many experiences. So maybe each of you could kind of share one experience that's kind of was the solution for that situation.
Yeah, Scott, maybe I'll start especially on the value side. I love casting a big umbrella around that visions and values work. I think it's really easy for families to say, oh my goodness, we're 3 generations, or sometimes even 4 generations. We're totally dispersed in terms of geography, in terms of politics, in terms of this, in terms of that. It's really easy to say we're not going to have anything in common. And some of the most rewarding work I've seen families do is when they find that they actually do have some things in common, right? And that there will be shared values. And just that exercise of going and talking about values and explaining what values you hold and why you hold them, I've seen that be transformational for families, because they're like, oh, I kind of get that now. And actually, I wouldn't articulate that value that way. I actually articulate it this way, and we have some common ground on this thing, right?
And how about in-laws? We get asked that question a lot. Should the in-laws be part of that umbrella, under that umbrella?
Right. How would you feel if you're excluded? How do you feel if somebody in some room without you is making decisions for your kids, about your potential grandkids? That doesn't feel really good, right? And there's times around ownership when there's certain conversations that the in-laws are not going to be involved, but any chance that the in-laws can be involved, I think it's a lost opportunity to not involve them. And I think it's going to create, it creates conflict, it creates stress. Right. So you have a partner going back to after some meeting, and they're, you're sleeping in the same bed. Of course, you're going to talk about these issues. And so the less you can have somebody feel like they don't have a voice, the less you can make them feel disenfranchised, the less conflict you're going to have across the family.
I would supplement that, Pat, by saying that there's a difference between a voice and a vote. And It may be that there are certain votes that are made only by, biological bloodline family members or adopted. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a seat at the table, hear the discussion, share your view. And I think part of it, I think folks want to be heard and have input, even if they don't necessarily get the outcome they were hoping for. So I think that's a sort of a corollary to Jim's comment. I would also say that we spend a lot of time working with families on building governance structures for the situation that you just described, where you have a combination of business owning and non-business owning family members, but where there's still some consolidated family management of wealth. There are times where family members, may say, you know what, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I really don't want to be invited to the party. And that's where it comes back to make sure that there's always an on-ramp back into the family if they want it. But there are times where you just have to say, hey, there's this segment of trusts or segment of this family meeting where we're going to talk about family business, and we're only going to have business owning members of the family present. And that's just a reality of the choice that someone made when they decided to sell and liquidate, is that they gave up those rights. That's a part of what they sold. And that's okay. They made that choice actively and of their own volition, hopefully. The other thing I would say is that, to the question specifically of in-laws, I could not agree more with Jim that having at least some conversations where spouses or partners are invited to attend is important, just because I think ultimately that's one of the parents of your grandchildren or great-grandchildren. And they're going to be raising those children. And so helping them have information about what is coming down the line for those kids, what is expected of them, what they need to be prepared to do, I think is really important, especially when you're doing things like, deciding about education or extracurricular activities, or, are they going to go to summer camp, or are they going to go work in the family business for the summer? These are all things that I think are really important information that spouses need to know. Same comment, you don't have to necessarily, open up the company books and show them everything, but, they're not dumb. They know more than you think they do. And they may have made assumptions that are incorrect. And so this is also an opportunity for level setting and sharing, shared expectations and getting buy-in into what it is that you're trying to build and do for your family.
Yeah, and I think that we're unfortunately out of time, because I really wanted you to talk more about Pathstone and what you can do for the families on this call. But I think what would be very helpful is this call is being recorded, as everybody knows, and we are going to send this out to everyone that was on this call, as well as anyone that registered in our database. And in that information, in that email that's going to go out, will include the contact information for both of you. Because I think there's a lot of people on this call that probably do have questions that they didn't want to put in the chat, and they would like to ask you, how do I get started? What if I want to talk to someone at Pathstone about designing my vision and my values and creating the plan that you have all described? How do I go about doing that? So I think that's an important conversation.
Well, please reach out. And I think and somebody put a question in there about transitioning from a family business to a family office and best practices. Like, reach out. I would love to talk through that. That's a whole nother hour webinar.
More than an hour, Jim.
But absolutely, shoot us thoughts, comments, questions, and we'll do our best to respond as quickly as we can.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both of you. I think this has been a very interesting and important and stimulating webinar today. Appreciate your participation. I also want to thank everyone that joined the call today. We had very active participation in terms of everybody stayed on till the end, and that's always a good sign. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for your participation. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.